So this is a seminar about points of information, which are a really small, as you can perhaps tell from the subtitle, part of BP, specifically debating. That is, that they only take 15 seconds, but are quite technical and quite important. And I think there are a lot of moving parts with how they work, and something that is quite daunting, to the extent that, although all of debating is daunting, I suppose having to respond to someone immediately after they ask you a question on something you have absolutely no notice of in advance is something that is tricky to do. Hopefully this seminar will help you navigate that, make you better at asking them in addition to answering them. So the way that this seminar is going to go is, firstly, we'll give a basic overview of what points of information are. Secondly, we'll talk about the rules, whether formal or informal rules associated with them. Thirdly, we'll talk about what I think are the 6 different types of point of information. Fourthly, we'll talk about the strategy associated with crafting and answering points of information. So, as a basic overview, what's a point of information? As I've covered, it is a short, 15-second maximum formalised interjection from any speaker on the other side of the debate to the current speaker who has the floor. Note, a point of information can take any form that you like, as long as it fits within that 15-second time frame, but in most circumstances takes the form of a question. Finally, while it is used in other forms of debating, such as world schools debating, some school tournaments, maybe even in like Asian 3-on-3 debating, it is most predominantly used in British parliamentary debating, and I think they're most interesting in the context of British parliamentary debating. So this seminar, while talking about POIs generally, will have a focus on those types, POIs as they exist in BP. The first thing I'll talk about is the requirements for when you're actively speaking, and that is that each speaker should accept at least one point of information. In the Worlds Handbook, this is defined as being a minimum requirement, meaning that if a speaker does not take a POI, they have failed something that they fundamentally ought to do. This is something that should be penalised harshly. The fact that a speaker has no time, say, as the excuse that is often given to take a point of information, does not excuse them for not doing such. I think it is something that represents a failure to engage with a crucial element of the debate. Moreover, each team at least should accept 2. I think notionally that just means each team should probably accept 1 from each of the opposition teams that they are facing. That is, if you're opening government, you should probably take 1 from opening opposition and closing opposition, and if you're any other position, take it from the 2 on the opposite bench to as you are. If you fail to do this, again, I think this is something that should be penalised harshly. Whenever you get up to speak, realise and budget your time for knowing that you will have to accept a brief interjection that might take up to 30-40 seconds. Second formal rule is about timing. Note that points of information can only be asked in protected time. That is, they're only allowed between 1 and 6 minutes. If you're doing another format, it might be between 1 and 7 minutes. So you have protected time in the first minute and the last minute, meaning that when you need to accept a point of information, make sure you do so before that protected time comes around, because you cannot do such when protected time is active. Secondly, points of information can be 15 seconds as an absolute maximum. Please respect this both as a speaker and as an asker of the point of information. Don't let your point of information drag on for 30 to 40 seconds. It's probably uncompelling at that point. It is probably a bit directionless and unlikely to be useful. But similarly, at the point where you accept a point of information as a speaker, you have to cede the floor to the person who is asking that for the 15 seconds they are allowed to have. That is, don't allow them to just say something for, 5 seconds and then immediately after shut them off from being able to say anything else. That is unpolite. It's also something that is unlikely to be viewed particularly favourably, to the extent that it can, lock out a team from asking the point of information that they actively want to do. Final thing I want to talk about in terms of formal rules is just, offering and accepting points of information and how that actually occurs. The first thing to note is points of information should be continuously offered. Speakers should always be offering points of information while they're sitting down at the bench. I think, a good minimum to aim for is maybe 1 every minute should be coming from your team. And the way that you go about offering them in real life is just by audibly saying point of information or sir or madam or some variant of that to just get the speaker's attention. Or online, it is kind of platform dependent. There are certain platforms like Mixidea where, there's a button you can click to offer a point of information. On Zoom, you might unmute yourself. On Zoom, you might do it over chat. It is best online to just check beforehand with the speaker who's about to speak to know how to best ask a point of information. Moreover, it is at the speaker's discretion when to accept a point of information, meaning you can't just start talking or start asking them a question. Obviously, it is up to the speaker to decide when they wish to engage with the point of information that you're offering. Moreover, although I say that you should continuously offer point of informations, don't badger the speaker. That is just repetitively and unreasonably asking them when the speaker clearly has no interest. That is like getting up every 4 seconds and saying, oh, point of information, point of information. If you have been rejected, probably wait before you try to ask them again. If you accept a point of information but you can't understand it, it is reasonable to ask for a rephrasing of it or a repetition of it, but please don't dwell on this for too long. At the point where it takes up, say, more than 30 seconds of your speech, it is probably best to just say, I don't understand what's being asked, and move on. Moreover, and similarly to that, points of information do not initiate any form of cross-floor dialogue. That is that if you ask a point of information, the speaker cannot then, ask you a question in response and then you parrot something back at them. Rather, the person who offers the point of information interjects briefly, the speaker deals with it, and then the debate moves on. If the person who initially asks wishes to follow up, they must do so by asking another point of information. Those are the simple formal rules. Some other rules that are, I guess, a bit more informal, aside from the first one, the points can only be asked to rival teams. That is, that teams on the government bench can only ask these to teams on the opposition bench, and similarly, opposition teams can only ask these to teams that are on the government bench. As an informal rule, though, teams should vary who they take their points of information from. I think, as I said earlier, it is wisest and probably safest to just take at least one from each rival team. If you take excess, that is, if you choose to take, 2 points of information per speech, which is something that you're free to do, then, you can vary who you take it from. My advice would probably be to take them from the stronger teams, in the same way that you want to take opposition teams on their best case when you're rebutting them. You don't, gain points from just dunking on the worst team in the room. It's probably best if you have excess dialogue with the teams that are strongest in the debate. But I think just as a general rule of thumb, take one from the opening and closing teams on the opposing bench that you are on. That just ensures best that you properly engage with all content of the debate, that you give a go to all teams to be able to say that which they want to say. A really crucial thing to discuss here, though, is the concept of lockouts. And a lockout occurs where a closing team does not accept any points of information from an opening team, which I guess shuts them out of engaging in the closing half of the debate. This is probably something that's happened to everyone at some stage, whether it be, that you have been locked out of a debate or you have inadvertently locked someone out of a debate. But it's something you should be particularly aware of and never let it happen, really ever. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is it's kind of impolite, but it also just sucks if you're an opening half team that, obviously does your speeches, early in the debate, but then you have to sit around for maybe up to like 40 minutes if you're the Prime Minister, say, or if you're the opening government team, and in that time you just have no input into the debate. That means your content can start to fall away, and while it might be advantageous for latter half teams to see the opening government's points start to fall away, it is not something that is like particularly persuasive. It looks like you're unfairly excluding them from having any form of input into the debate. You should especially not let this happen, though, if your opening government team, say if you're closing opposition and at risk of locking out an opening government team, if they're a particularly strong team, if you have not responded to their content otherwise, or if they're just continuously offering points of information. The best way to avoid locking out a team is just to keep a mental note or even a physical note noting who your team has taken points of information from. I think as a general rule of thumb, it is best if whip speakers take opening half teams when they're doing their points of information, because that means those opening half teams have, I guess, the priority chance to engage the most late point in the debate. If a team is ever locked out, or if a team ever locks another team out, it is something that should be assessed by the judge. It should probably, similarly to not accepting a point of information in the first place, be something that is penalised relatively harshly. The only other thing I'd say about lockouts is that if you are about to be locked out, it is worth kicking up a bit of a fuss. Rather than saying audibly point of information, it might be worth saying don't lock us out, because that sends a reminder to the closing team and also to the adjudicator, who might not be tracking these things particularly closely, that you haven't had a chance to weigh into the closing half clash. On lockouts as well, I don't think this occurs to the same extent and is far less important if it happens to a closing half team. That is, if an opening half team does not engage with a closing half team, well, obviously the closing team speaks after them, so it's less important. Those similarly, opening half teams should try to engage with closing teams by accepting their points of information, probably as soon as they can, just so they can kind of get on the floor earlier, so all the content that could possibly be discussed in the debate is out for a longer period of time. Now, outside of rules, let's talk about the types of points of information, but firstly a few caveats with that. The first is that recall that points of information can be anything and done in any structure, so there are no formal categories. They could both be a rebuttal point of information while pointing out a contradiction, while being an analogy, while whipping material that you've already established. These are just, I think, separate enough areas that I'm able to identify that I think, warrant being discussed in their own right. The second thing I'll say that has made this seminar, I guess, a bit difficult to construct is that points of information are extraordinarily context specific, so it's hard to give concrete examples as to what makes a good point of information, and there's no hard and fast rules or chestnut POIs that you always ask or that will always work. It will always vary. Anyways, what do I think the 6 broad types of points of information are? Firstly, I think there are rebuttal POIs. Secondly, contradictions. Thirdly, analogies. Fourthly, whipping material. Fifth, extending the debate. And sixthly, points of clarification, which are a bit of a unique category that I'll cover last. So let's go through those one by one. The first type of point of information is a rebuttal point of information. And by now, hopefully you all know what rebuttal is. That is just attempting to undermine the analysis that's being provided by a rival team. And I think there are 4 types. The first is just mitigatory rebuttal, which tries to lessen the impact, I suppose, of, a rival team's arguments. And while this is strong, I don't think these are particularly useful in the context of offering a point of information, to the extent that a mitigatory piece of rebuttal doesn't, defeat the analysis that is being provided, but at best only lessens its impact or weight to a certain extent. It doesn't fully overcome it. The second type of rebuttal is trying to just out and out disprove what your opposition's saying, showing the falsity of it, undermining the premise on which it operates. This is obviously something that is particularly useful in the context of a point of information. If you're able to, within 15 seconds, show that the analysis that's being provided by a team is analysis that is untrue, or is analysis that is, premised on a lie, then that is something that is extraordinarily useful and something that ought to be prioritized probably over mitigatory pieces of analysis. The third type of rebuttal is, I guess, weighing rebuttal. That is to trade off the costs and benefits that might be associated with, the certain policies or priorities that the team is targeting. And while these can be useful for points of information in certain circumstances, I think especially when you're whipping a point in a point of information, I don't think these are something that should be, prioritized particularly largely, especially early in debates. The final basic type of rebuttal is, I guess, just flipping the premise of what an opposition team is arguing. So you might agree with all their analysis, you might agree with the principle that they're setting up, but show that it works in an opposite way to what they claim it to do. This will obviously vary based on the debate, but this is a useful thing to ask in a point of information, firstly for the reason that it is something that is quite concise. Moreover, because it often relies on foundational analysis that has been provided by a rival team, it means that you don't need to kind of go into massive detail in order to establish a point of information like this. So what a point of information like that would look like, I suppose, is to say, say a rival team is talking a lot about freedom of speech being particularly important, and therefore, they want... an example that we'll go through later is restrictions being used on social media on what you can post. Say a rival team is explaining why freedom of speech is a particularly paramount consideration. You might do a point of information and say, well, given that freedom of speech is paramount, don't you think people are, more free to speak their mind when they're not scared of operating on a certain platform? Something like that doesn't require huge investment from you, but is able to ride on analysis that they've provided and give them something to think about. Rebuttal points of information, like all points of information, can be framed as either a question or just stated outright, but I think more than other types of point of information, stating rebuttal ones outright is probably, more frequent, I suppose. I think then it's worth considering when you should ask something as a question and when you should just state it outright. I'll start with just stating it outright, and what that takes the form of is effectively they're just providing analysis, and as you would do in a substantive speech, you just maybe get up and say, no, this is wrong for 2 reasons. I think this is a difficult thing to do because obviously you're constrained by time and have a 15-second limit, but perhaps where, a closing team or a whip is introducing new material that no one's had the chance to respond to, and you have some sort of easy way of knocking it out, it's worth doing. But I'd note that you should only do this where the team is saying something that is very clearly untrue and can be easily disproven within the 15-second time gap. Otherwise, and in most circumstances, it's better to just frame it as some sort of question, because I guess a question inherently probably causes, a speaker to respond to what is being asked of them. Whereas if you just try to rebut them on the spot and say, please respond to this analysis, they can just say things like, well, no, I've just established foundational reasons why it might be true. No, I disagree with your analysis. That again, you've only had 15 seconds to prove. So I think in most circumstances, it is best to ask a question. Okay, second type of point of information, I think, is to point out contradictions that might exist within, a rival team's case. I think the best way you can use a contradiction is to point out where their own analysis conflicts with other areas of their own analysis, but it doesn't need to be only a internal contradiction, say. You might also note where their analysis is contradictory or conflicts with the information slide that was provided, or with, the reality that people know to be true inherently. I think the way that these should be formatted is to say, well, how can it be simultaneously true that, X is occurring when in reality, or when you earlier established, or in many circumstances that is particularly useful, say if a closing team is, targeting a specific route to victory with a unique extension, you might say, well, how can it be true that how can your extension be something that is true when your own opening suggested this thing that might run counter to that is something that is true? That is a useful way of framing a point of information. I'll use an example from a debate that I was recently taking part in, and the topic for that debate was, as an aspiring artist, we would choose to stay independent rather than sign with a major record label. And the government team made two arguments. I can't recall if they were both made by opening government or both made by closing government, or split between those teams. But one of the arguments was, well, artists are able to use people like agents or publicists to ensure that they get connected and get opportunities in the mainstream and thus, ensure a livelihood for themselves. But, at some other point in the government case, they suggested, well, major record labels trap people with egregious contracts that lock them in for life that should say, that are particularly predatory and particularly harmful. A good point of information then is simply something like, how can it be simultaneously true that this artist cannot afford a lawyer to avoid dodgy contracts while being able to simultaneously, afford a promoter or agent who can launch them into the mainstream and get them heaps of money? Something to that effect. I think points of information that point out contradictions are good because inherently they just result in a speaker being stumped. If you found something that truly is contradictory, it's almost necessary for a speaker to backpedal to a certain extent or to maybe diminish the importance of one of the claims that they have made, or prioritize one over the other, which, in some circumstances and in egregious circumstances can result in a closing team potentially knifing an opening team, which is of course useful if you're on the opposite bench to them. But it also doesn't give away aspects of your own case, or I guess require a lot of intellectual work from you to, establish why your own government claim runs counter to an opposition claim. You're simply using the analysis that they themselves have provided. And in that sense, I guess, keeping your powder dry somewhat, making sure you're not exposing analysis, earlier in the debate. I think these are extremely good to use if you have nothing else. And I think they're good to use in opening half clashes, especially if you're a closing team and you don't want to reveal your extension. I'll talk about why you might not want to reveal your extension later in this seminar. Third type of point of information, I think, are to use analogies, and that is just comparing another team's analysis with a similar scenario that might exist. That might be a similar scenario that is, very along the lines of what the debate is, or it could be a similar scenario, I guess they could be very different things, but if the principle is similar, then it's worth going for these. I think these are useful when you're making an attack based on the principled consistency of a claim that is being made by a rival team. So you're attacking the universality or the robustness of their argument. I think the way that you try to frame these points or articulate them is to ask, well, would you support, and then say a similar scenario, but of course that similar scenario should be a way, way, way more extreme version. I think it's worth really pushing the envelope here without getting into like comical territory. And moreover, I think it's useful to frame these things as yes or no questions with the goal to back a rival team into a corner, wherein if they say yes and support the extreme analogy that you have made, it makes them look like an insane team or an unjust team. Or if they say no, it serves to undermine their case or weakens their principle because it suggests that principle might not be as robust or universal as they have otherwise made it out to be. Some examples of that taking place is the topic I talked to you a bit about earlier. That is that social media companies should aggressively censor offensive and discriminatory content. Say your opening opposition team gets up and suggests, well, this will harm freedom of speech, and freedom of speech is a particularly important thing. Well, a useful government point of information here might be, should people have the freedom to use violently homophobic or racist slurs in public? This kind of backed an opposition team into a corner, because if they say yes, well then they seem a bit unjustified, because I think most people could agree that those things are somewhat bad. But if they say, well, people should not have the freedom to do such, then it at least will require them to go on a pretty big diversion to explain why it is principally different for someone to, in public, be particularly racist and use slurs like that, in the mainstream, when it is justified for people to, in an online sphere, post things that are aggressive, offensive, and discriminatory. In either way, it's useful for the government to attack on that basis. I think another example, but a more, disconnected from the topic at least in direct ways, is if there's a topic, well, we should allow employers to access the criminal records of prospective employees. A useful opposition point of information here that I have seen is, do you think the government should only release prisoners when they have been 100% rehabilitated? And this forces, firstly, the government to think for a bit, to the extent that it's not innately clear what is being asked here. But if they say yes, well, that's kind of insane, because the capacity of an individual to be 100% rehabilitated is relatively low. But if they say no, it undermines their case to a certain extent, because the point that the opposition is trying to get at here is that employers will never employ criminals if they suspect, that they are criminals, if they suspect recidivism might be something that could occur. That is something that is a bit more speculative, but hopefully you can see the way that these kind of analogize a, I guess, relatively mundane or relatively simple motion with a more extreme version that in both circumstances puts a rival team on the back foot. The fourth type of point of information is whipping. This occurs where, and is done by any team to bring their material back to the fore, usually opening half teams. I know the term whip in BP is particularly used in the context of the whip speaker, but whipping as, a concept in debating is just saying things that have already been said, particularly by your team. And you can probably inherently then see why this is useful for opening teams. That is that once an opening half is finished, well, then there's about 30 minutes of the debate left, and both opening teams have no opportunity to substantively input anything other than these 15-second interjections, for which they might only have one accepted late in the debate. So it is particularly useful for opening teams to use where their material is at risk of falling out of the debate. If you don't know what falling out means, it's kind of self-explanatory. That is that you might have had this, big principled point, or you might have had, this important substantive point, but no one's really responded to it, say, or it got one response and then subsequently it's not really been talked about. If you're OG and that happens, it's really frustrating, because maybe that material by its, own value doesn't deserve to fall out, but everyone's just neglected it, perhaps even just because they're massive cowards. If you notice that is occurring, it is worth suggesting or offering a point of information to a closing team to try to bring it back to the fore. Moreover, when you're trying to whip your own analysis, it's worth explicitly reminding the room what content is yours, because often these things can become muddled, especially where, say, you're an opening opposition team, and you make a point about, the banking system collapsing if the government policy is passed, and then closing opposition come out and make another point about how the banking system might collapse. It might be worth, when you're whipping your own analysis, to just suggest, when we were the first team to tell you that the banking system was at risk of collapse at the point where this policy was passed, and then continue with your point of information. That just sends a message, I guess, to the entirety of the room, but most importantly to the adjudicator, that was your analysis. It is always worth flagging where you make your own unique contributions to the debate, to the extent that that's something that's assessed particularly scrupulously in British parliamentary debating. So, I think whipping points of information take three forms. I think the first and most simple one is just reminding the room of that which you said. It is explicitly bringing back your content and asking for it to be responded to. It is useful where your content is particularly strong but is falling out of the debate. That would take the form of just saying, well, we told you X, please respond to X, because, they might not otherwise be responding to it. The second type is reinvigorating your material, and that is reusing the analysis or headline points you've provided in a new context to respond to other teams' arguments. For example, you might have a big principled contention at opening opposition that opening government don't really engage with, and closing government, have their own principled analysis, but they don't, respond directly to your principle with it. You might ask them a point of information that notes that your principle is a more important thing, or that your principle has already gone part of the way to disprove their principle. Moreover, your analysis might just take on a life of its own in the closing half, and you might want to, specifically define where you think it fits into the closing half clash and the debate as a whole. I think this is particularly useful where your material was preemptive or it has implicit responses. So whenever you're sitting in a room and you're an opening government team not having a point of information be accepted, but you think, oh my god, we already responded to this, clearly our analysis responds to this, it might be worth asking a point of information that explicitly points that out. And a good way to frame that would just be to say, well, how can Y be true when we gave you analysis that shows that X is in fact true? The final way of whipping material in a point of information, at least in the way that I see it, is in a framing point of information, and that is just directly asking a rival team to trade off their own content against your own content. The way that would, or the form that would take, is to suggest, well, even if your, closing analysis as to Y is something that is true, why is it more important than our thing that we talked about, X being true? And I think these are particularly useful and maybe underutilized to a certain extent, and I think should be used where the scale or probability of your benefits and harms differ, but I think they're useful for the reason that it kind of just forces a rival speaker to directly take their own extension and directly compare it to your own extension in terms of the value that it results in. Because maybe the rebuttal that they have to your extension is exclusively stuff that tries to disprove it, not necessarily talk about how important it is or the probability of it, occurring or not occurring. Note especially that these last two ones, I think, are better than reminding, because reinvigorating your material and framing your material against material that comes up later is something that inherently just reminds people of it. So I would prioritize doing these latter two things. The final thing I'll say on whipping is that you just have the capacity to combine all three of these types of whipping your own material when asking a point of information. But it's important to not go overboard and try to bring back every single piece of your content, but maybe the one piece of your content that's been specifically neglected, or maybe the one piece of your content that you think is, the debate-winning thing that you think is the most important contribution that you have. So an example of a point of information that uses all these three types of whipping, using the topic earlier about social media companies, is you might say, if you're, an opening government team trying to get back in the debate, we showed you that free speech is not an absolute right. That is reinvigorating your material because presumably it is responding to a closing opposition team who is suggesting that there is some sort of right to freedom of speech. Then you'd say, but even if it is, why is guaranteeing freedom of speech to people who might use it perniciously more important? Asking why it is more important directly frames it and forces a trade-off between your analysis and the, closing half analysis that has taken place. Why is it more important than protecting those who might be harmed by it? And protecting those who might be harmed by it is probably the main substantive push that you made at opening government that could have by now fallen out of the debate. But because it is concise, it forces people to respond to it. Sweet. The fifth type of point of information, and I guess one that's quite similar to whipping content, is extending or reframing the debate. I'll cover this quite quickly, and that will be apparent why soon, but this is just used to expand the scope of the debate or introduce new material. It is useful in contexts where the debate is narrow, or even if you're, an opening half team, you realize something is really important late, and you might have a 15-second burst that could of itself win the debate when you're otherwise getting slaughtered, though I do think it's something that's primarily done with closing teams who are trying to get their material out into the playing field earlier in the context of the debate. Moreover, I think these things are often similar to rebuttal points of information. Maybe they're not necessarily tied to, a direct extension, but to the extent that rebuttal might be a new piece of rebuttal, well, then I guess it counts as, an extending or reframing piece of analysis. In terms of how you would frame these points or say them aloud, I think the more open-ended you can keep things, the better, and the more, I suppose, speculative or far-flung you can make it, the better, just so teams don't, have a concrete idea as to what your extension takes the form of. I'll discuss that on the next slide. So some examples of this. This House believes that progressives should actively use religious doctrine to advance their messaging. We'll say that this debate is taking place, and I've been in a debate where this is taking place, and all the analysis until that point is centered on how this would, affect the United States. You might ask something like, well, do you think the cultural wars have been won in Pakistan? You're clearly then taking the debate to a place where it has not otherwise been. You can see other examples there, but I'll move on for the sake of brevity. So, moving on to a strategic thing, and that is, well, should I reveal my extensions in point of informations? I would actually advise against this in most circumstances, emphasis on most circumstances, because there are some where it is justified. I would advise against this for a number of reasons. I think the first thing is just it risks allowing opening teams to pick it up. Say you're a closing opposition team and the Prime Minister takes a point of information and you reveal this elaborate extension. Well, how elaborate can it actually be when you've only got 15 seconds to display it? And the opening opposition team could just claim that they had that content as well, and probably in, opposition leader if it's really good, or backloaded in deputy leader of the opposition, and consequently your capacity to claim it uniquely as your own is probably limited and diminished to a massive extent. Moreover though, and I think more harmfully, if you just bring up an extension really early in the debate, it's unlikely you have an extension that can be conveyed in a way that is adequate to the adjudicator in 15 seconds, while also remaining a secret to the rest of the teams. That is, if the adjudicator can work out what angle you're going for, probably every other speaker in the debate can work out what you're going for, and thereafter, the DLO or the DPM is able to just come out and destroy your extension before it's even, had any time to breathe in the debate. It is therefore really harmful and really difficult to get up after analysis has been rebutted for, two speakers, say, and then suggest, no, actually, actually, here's our extension in more nuance, I think by that point, you've kind of just lost it. You might say, well, won't the adj give us credit for the point, even if opening steals it? But I don't necessarily think this is the case, because I think if simply saying a point with, 15 seconds of depth was enough to dibs that point, well, notionally, a closing opposition team who gets a POI accepted by the Prime Minister before opening opposition has even got out the chance to speak, could just, within those 15 seconds, try to dibs the 3 best opposition points. But that never really happens, and to the extent that it would happen, I think it would be viewed as something that is unfair, but as I already said, you're unlikely to be able to illustrate those points with sufficient nuance, meaning you're probably not going to get credit for that point. It's probably best to just, leave it for when you actually come up in closing half. I think if you leave it for closing half as well, you just give more for your member to talk about, which is beneficial. The other thing is, even if you do have a point, and even if it is unique, and even if it is something that is said at a time that is opportune, maybe you say it during the DPM speech really late, 30 seconds, or I guess a minute before DLO is going to come up and you reveal your extension. Well, maybe if DLO just, spends 20 seconds of analysis on that, the adjudicator, who in many circumstances might not be particularly good, might not realize that that was your content initially. A lot of adjudicators, I don't even think, realize who it is specifically that's asking points of information, more so the content that it's in it and the bench that it is being asked on. That is why I think I would avoid revealing extensions in almost all circumstances. But there are certain exceptions. For example, the closing government is free to ask the deputy leader of opposition, a point of information that reveals partially their extension, given that opening government is finished in the debate and they can no longer say anything else, but that is still subject to certain risks because maybe DLO has preempted this material, maybe they'll be able to dust it off and knock it out. Moreover, I think maybe it's worth revealing your extension where you have 5 points of extension, say. Maybe you don't want to cover all of them. Maybe you think one of those extensions sucks and you kind of want, opening opposition to pick it up, so they're wasting their time on it. Where your extension is a complex thing, it might be okay because, the opening opposition or opening government team might not be able to pick up the complexity associated with it and thereafter, take it in a satisfactory manner. You'll probably still be able to, convert and lay out all the nuances associated with it and be credited for it. Moreover, it is useful in circumstances, I suppose, where a point of information would just really devastate a good opening team. Say, you are a closing government team and opening government kind of is just not very good, and it is very clear that opening opposition is going to win the opening half really easily. Even if you think at closing government, well, we can still beat opening opposition by our own right, maybe the fact that opening opposition have won opening half so clearly means that the adjudicator might perceive it that they're just so far ahead in the debate. Maybe if you have a point of information that really can knock them out, then it is worth, exposing to them. The final thing I'd say in an exception is it's maybe worth in certain circumstances giving a red herring extension as a point of information. And what I mean by that is just, claiming that this is an extension, but it not actually being something you've invested no time in, and then causing kind of panic in the opening half while, your own opening scrambles to convert that to being their own material, while your rival team on the opening half of the bench tries to come up with a number of responses to it. Maybe that wastes a lot of time, but I don't think it's something that's particularly sustainable, especially at, higher level of debating, but it is something that is remarkably funny when it does occur. The final type of point of information are points of clarification, which are quite unique, and these occur really at the start of the debate where a team is unsure about a crucial element of setup or the model, without which the debate could probably become unclear. Inherently to that, they're probably exclusively asked to opening government. When you are asking a point of clarification, instead of saying point of information, or maybe even instead of clicking a POI button, it's worth typing in chat or unmuting yourself and saying point of clarification, because in most circumstances, most people will accept them. Note though, you should ask these in good faith, and you should only ask these when you have a pretty important clarification on the grounds in which it's taken place. Maybe, crucial terms in the motion haven't really been defined. Maybe specific percentages, were just unclear to you because OG rushed through them. It's worth just asking so the debate takes place on relatively fair grounds. But ask them in good faith. Don't say, I've got a point of clarification, then just ask them a devastating point of information. You'll kind of be perceived as being a bit of an asshole if you do that. Anyways, the other thing to say about them is they are technically not, they don't have an inherently special status according to the rules of debating, which I looked up for this seminar. So you have no obligation to accept them, which is reasonable enough, because otherwise people could probably just bog you down with them for ages. But secondly, it does count towards your point of information threshold. That is that if you accept one point of clarification, well, you're under no obligation to accept another point of information later in your speech. But I put big asterisks there because I think points of clarification, and most people would agree, have a relatively unique status in the context of debating. I would therefore strongly advise that you take a point of clarification. clarification. And the reason for that is, just recall firstly, that British parliamentary debating is not as much about who has the stronger argument or who spends more time on certain arguments, but rather is about your team's overall contribution to the debate as it exists. And moreover, the opening government team has an obligation. It is their duty in the debate to set and define the motion. So they should be rewarded, to the extent that they fulfill their role in the debate at large. So, it is wise for an opening government team to ensure that the debate takes place on stable ground, to ensure that every single team understands, the way that the debate is going to occur, what the world specifically looks like, if, the model is something that's complex, if there's been a lengthy information slide, if setup is something that takes a few minutes in your debate. In fact, whenever I'm speaking at Prime Minister and there is setup associated with my speech, normally at the end of that setup, I'll just say, if anyone needs clarification, now's the time, and let someone, ask if it's important. Because I think the trade-off, the 20 seconds you'll lose, clarifying a percentage that you might have omitted or saying yes or no to a question is probably worth the more stable ground the debate thereafter takes place on. So some examples of point of clarification. If people remember that demonstration debate that we did a few weeks ago, where it was that we would prefer a world where everyone is physically indistinguishable, I rushed through my setup to a certain extent, and there was a question saying, are people able to wear different clothing or do things like have cosmetic surgery? Because that wasn't necessarily something that was clear. I took this point of clarification and said, no, you're not allowed to wear different clothing. The government issues it. You're not allowed to have cosmetic surgery, but you can have other pieces of surgery. That's something that's really rapid, and thereafter, the debate's on more stable ground. But importantly as well, there's a chance, in the context of that debate, that maybe closing opposition are asking me that point of clarification because they're wanting to run an extension about why people can never truly be physically indistinguishable, because now clothing will be more important. Now people who have access to things like cosmetic surgery will just be systemically advantaged because they're the only ones who can change up what they look like. So clarifying that might have actually benefited our team to the extent that it knocks out the capacity for that analysis to be made by closing opposition. And that's where I get to the last point that I've noted here, that strategically it might be best not to ask to avoid your extension perhaps being excluded from the debate. For example, I remember doing a debate a few years ago where the topic was, we would prefer a world where everyone spoke one language. And as opening government, my team didn't define whether this was just we all woke up tomorrow and everyone spoke one language, or whether throughout all of time everyone always just spoke one language. It would have been more beneficial if the prior was true, if everyone just woke up tomorrow speaking one language in the context in which that debate operated. But because we didn't establish that, closing opposition, I think, were free to get up and explain why, things like the colonial era would have been so much worse if there was only one language spoken. It was quite a good debate where sadly we took an easy fourth. I think because we didn't accept points of clarification, because we didn't establish the debate on stable ground. Another example is just, if you get a topic that we would prefer the world without the ultra-rich, maybe the opening government team just launches into analysis about, eating the rich or whatever. Maybe it's worth, if you're the opening opposition even, or an opposition team, suggesting, hey, what actually counts as the ultra-rich? Are we talking the top 50 people in the world, or the top 20% of people in the world? That might be particularly material to how you go forward with the debate. The advice there then is, I think always take at least one point of clarification and thereafter take another point of information, because I think it is something that is essential for role fulfillment. And secondarily, if you're unsure about a point of setup in the debate, feel free to ask points of clarification. That is all for the types of points of information. We're now going to briefly talk about the strategy in which points of information offer, noting that while talking about those types, I did spend a fair bit of time explaining when you should offer those types of point of information and how you should word them. So this strategy section should not take as long. So when do you accept points of information? So I think there are some pieces of advice generally. Firstly, do not accept them mid-sentence or even mid-point. A lot of speakers that I see who haven't debated for long are midway through a sentence and then, they get asked a point of information and just go, yep. And then that whole sentence is lost. They'll have to backtrack and go back to it. Or, mid-sentence, they'll go no to the point of information and get confused in their head. Keep in control of your own speech. If you leave someone standing for 15 seconds because you're wrapping something up, that is fine. Note, secondly, you can just accept a point of information whenever you want, keeping in mind that you have to accept one, and that one that you accept has to take place between 1 and 6 minutes. But you best know your own structure and timing, and it is legitimate for you to request or delay a POI. Meaning if someone gets up to offer, you can say, I'll take you in a minute, Or if no one's getting up, when you get to like 5 minutes 30, you can say, I'll take a POI from closing now. Maybe closing don't have one and you'll just move on and take one from opening, or you'll take one from no one. But it's fine for you to ask for someone to offer a point of information when you're speaking. You don't have to just offer it when, accept it when people are offering. The other thing I'll say is never accept more than 2 POIs. It's advisable to accept 1 to 2. I think it's become increasingly the norm for speakers to only accept 1, but definitely don't accept more than 2, because if you do, your speech just becomes predominantly a defensive speech. That is almost all that what you're talking about eventually just becomes trying to ward off rival teams' arguments rather than making your own arguments, which is something that is often not particularly compelling. You're just giving them more chances to interject within your speeches. That said, if you accept 1 to 2, that is good. That is perfectly acceptable. If you accept 2, that is good because you're engaging more with other teams. But once you cross the 2 points of information threshold, that is when it becomes a bit too much. The other thing I'd say generally is just don't accept your points of information too early, and I think this is especially true in constructive or substantive speeches. So that is if you're speaking member or you're speaking as the leader of your team in Prime Minister or leader of the opposition. If you've, just stepped through your setup and your model and then you immediately accept a point of information, well then immediately you're sort of fighting the debate on the grounds of other teams. If you're a member speaker, you might not have time to get out your extension. Obviously accept a point of information, but only do so after you've, explained a sufficient amount of your speech that if you were to have stopped there, there's probably enough in that speech to make sure your team has good standing in the debate, in the event that the point of information could, wildly but, foreseeably take you the rest of your speech because it might particularly stump you or something. Further considerations in terms of when to accept points of information, it might be worth considering who's actually offering the point of information. If there are like 8 people in the room, obviously, and 4 who can offer you points of information, if one of them's like the reigning world champion or something, and the other person on that team is a novice who you don't think is particularly good, it might be worth waiting for the novice to offer a point of information. It might not be worth, accepting the point of information from a person who is particularly aggressive when they offer it, because that might be a sign that they're really confident about their point of information. It's worth in the back of your mind thinking about who you would prefer to take points of information from. Secondly, listen to the phrasing that the point of information takes. Instead of saying point of information, in many circumstances, you might be in your speech and say, I'm now going to discuss the economy, and someone will say, yes, on that, meaning that their point of information is specifically referring to the economy generally. And if the economic arguments that you have, firstly, haven't been made yet because you're just moving on to that, or is an area of your speech you're particularly comfortable with, it is probably worth taking the point of information there, because in many circumstances it won't even require a deviation from what you're going to talk about otherwise. Maybe they'll ask you a point of information about the economy, and then you can say, sweet, here are the 4 things I've got to talk about the economy from in direct response to that. The other thing is the phrasing of the POI. If they say point of clarification, as we've just discussed, probably take if your setup is otherwise complete. Sweet. In terms of answering points of information then, a few pieces of general advice. The first is points of information that are asked of you are probably being asked for a reason, that reason being to undermine you or your team, or to set up a team that is speaking later in the debate and allow them to get away with some sort of content that they might not have otherwise been able to. I think then it is worthwhile to try to limit the amount of concessions that you make in your speeches. Secondly, to avoid binary responses to things. So when I was talking about analogies earlier as a type of point of information, note that, when they're asked as a yes or no question, well, often that yes is made to make you look like an idiot and the no is made to undermine your case. In most circumstances, the answer, of course, is more complex than that, and feel free to take, the time that you need. After someone's spent their 15 seconds, you're free to answer however you want in the remainder of your speaking time. So try to avoid binary responses, because often they are a trap one way or another. And thirdly, try to distinguish unfavorable scenarios. If someone asks you an analogy and, both answers seem terrible, maybe it's a binary answer again that they're asking for, try to distinguish as to why something is different. Don't just fall into the habit of trying to deal with POIs immediately, because if you're trying to deal with them, super rapidly and get back to your speech within 10 seconds, often you give an answer that undermines your case or, sets things up perfectly for a team that is trying to undermine you. Secondly, when you're answering a point of information, take a half second to think, oh, do I have anything about this in my notes? Maybe you think, oh, have I already answered this point of information earlier within my speech? If you have such, then use those structured responses you have. It is useful, especially in the context of defeating whipping POIs. That is, if the opening government team asks you a point of information saying, hey, please respond to our content. Well, if you're a whip worth their salt, you probably have responses to their content already, so you can go straight to that stuff. Thirdly, reorder your speech if necessary. Say if you have 3 elements of your speech, you're talking about the economy, then you're talking about how this affects mental health, and then you're talking about like something else, I don't know. And, you're doing it in the order, first economy, second mental health, third something else. And then you finished your point about the economy, and then someone says, hello, I have a question regarding, something else, and the POI is dealing with that. If you say, oh, well, I'm dealing with that later, that is kind of perceived in debating as shorthand for, I don't really have a response to that, let me think about it, which is kind of perceived, whether fairly or unfairly, as being something that's not particularly useful. It might be better to just restructure your speech and say, okay, I'm now going to deal with this thing about something else first, and then I'll delay my analysis about mental health. The fourth piece of general advice is just keep an eye out for extension POIs, whether while you're speaking or when you're just on the bench. That is, if a closing team has not listened to this seminar and decides to just expose what their extension is, it's worth taking notes on it. It's worth, getting your brain jogging, thinking of responses in advance to it, knocking it out before it occurs. But keep in mind that it could be a red herring. It could be something that's just particularly absurd, in which case don't spend too much time on it, but have it in the back of your mind. It's useful. In terms of answering point of information further, I guess the question that is often asked when you haven't, done a lot of debating is, well, what do I do when I get stumped? And I think you can get stumped in 2 ways. Either firstly, because you've been asked a really good and devastating point of information, or secondly, because the point of information is just an absurd one. Firstly, if you're asked a good point of information, feel free to take a quick moment, but only a couple of seconds maximum, but note a couple of seconds, is a surprisingly long time when your brain's rushing. I think a lot of people have the tendency to try to respond to a point of information literally at the point where it finishes being asked, and in many circumstances that just means you don't give a satisfactory answer. If you stop and think for a few seconds, you're more likely to say something that will be useful. Secondly, act confident in your response, even if your analysis is terrible. If you're confident while presenting it, then it will sound better. The alternative is still presenting that same terrible analysis, but just saying, oh my gosh, this analysis is terrible, in which case an adjudicator will probably agree. Thirdly, say a variation of, I am covering that later. I have already covered this. Even if you haven't, you might trick the adjudicator, or you'll, give yourself time to think about it in the back of your mind, or do the classic, my partner will cover that, and, throw them under the bus. Or say your partner even did cover that, and maybe lose them some speaks in the process, or better yet, they'll have some time to, think of responses before they come up to speak. The final thing you can do is just to, I guess the final gambit is to just suggest, well, that point is absurd and terrible. If someone asks a really good POI, you'll just be like, that makes no sense, mate. I don't know what you're talking about. What a rubbish point. You'll be surprised at how regularly that works, which is kind of disappointing in a way. But, it's worth doing if you've got nothing else to suggest, because it can make the team that asks it look dumb when, in fact, they are particularly smart. The second way you could get stumped is because the point of information is absurd. This is the sort of, point of information that was asked in the demo debate, that was about people being physically indistinguishable. The question was, well, would you prefer a world with a god? That is kind of confusing when you just ask that in the first case. Take a moment and ask them to repeat the POI if it is particularly absurd. Secondly, though, recall that it's probably being asked for a reason. It might be a trap. So just move on if you have nothing else to say to it. Give a quick response. Try to not make a concession. Try to, distinguish what is being asked from other things that we've already covered. Try to not dwell on things that stump you if you can. Finally, in terms of crafting and offering points of information, I think the best way to craft them well is to just realize how important points of information are. If this seminar has not convinced you of that, realize that you'll probably only have 2 accepted in the round, since most, teams only accept 2 in total during their contributions. And note that if you're the opening team, you might only have one 15-second interjection to talk in the final 30 minutes of the entire debate, which is a exceptionally short amount of time, meaning it is not good to just ask a POI off, the cuff. You hear, some little tidbit of their speech that you think is silly, and you get up to try to, score a point on something that's not particularly important in the context of the debate. Make sure you strategize, you think about what the point of information you're going to ask will be, and get approval from your partner. Don't rush it, because you don't want to piss off your partner by asking something that isn't going to be useful in the context of the round, but moreover, they might have something that is useful, and together you might be able to realize what is your best avenue to victory, even if it is only a 15-second avenue. So strategize. Ask yourself, if you're an opening team especially, is our content falling out of the debate, and how best do we bring it back? Do we try to reinvigorate it? Do we ask the closing opposition team to frame it, frame their analysis against ours? Is there a glaring contradiction that nobody has pointed out in one of the speeches that is going on currently? And can I, within 15 seconds, articulate that in a way that will be satisfactory to the adjudicator? Is there a compelling analogy that I can draw to this point? Is that analogy something that will force the other team into a corner? Think about these things before you get up and offer something that isn't particularly good. But if you have nothing else, it is best to probably just get up and do some sort of basic whipping of your material, ask for responses to that. Fourthly, delegate responsibility to speakers who aren't under stress. That is, if you're on the closing government team, don't ask for your government whip speaker to do the points of information when, the opposition member is speaking. That is something that is quite hard to do. It will often detract either from the points of information or from the speech that is about to take place. So delegate responsibility appropriately. Fourthly, listen really closely to speakers as they are speaking on the floor. It is a waste to try to whip your content or get up in a point of information and say, hello, can you respond to our analysis at OG, when they've just spent the last 2 minutes responding directly to your analysis at OG. And this is something that happens particularly frequently. And maybe you don't think the analysis that they have provided in response to you has been sufficient, but they'll always just say, I literally just did this. If you think their analysis wasn't sufficient, try to craft it in a POI, try to ask a question, maybe position them in a way where they have to frame that point of information, frame your content against their content. That would be useful. But moreover, listen closely to speakers to the extent that you should time your asking when they're wrapping up points or subpoints. So if they say, and finally, it might be worth starting to get up to offer a point of information, that makes you minorly more likely to be accepted than, the other team on your own bench who, remember, you are also debating against. Finally, in terms of wording a point of information, which is associated with crafting that, don't overload your POI. Only encompass, 2 to 3 things max within it. It's not strategically useful, and you can't illustrate things with sufficient nuance if you just get up and say, hey, we provided you these 4 points, respond to all of them, please. It is probably best to identify your one path to victory in the debate that you think might be narrow, rapidly closing, and try to directly go through there. Because otherwise, your POI will just get lost as well. Even if it is like a 4-fold POI that is perfectly constructed, because it has so many elements to it, a speaker might be able to cheekily just respond to one element of it, or they might even only hear one element of it, and then once they respond to that, it could be perceived as sufficient from an adjudicator who's struggling to encompass 5 things, within their notes when you have 15 seconds to deliver it. Secondly, try to use wording that gains the concessions you want. Often, and as I've said a few times, POIs are asked for a reason, so instead of just saying this is principally consistent with this, would you support this other thing? It's best to just, outwardly word it as, isn't it true that X is the case? Wouldn't you agree that Y? Tacitly and subconsciously, this often means a speaker will make a concession without wanting to do so because you, appear to be their friends or whatever, when instead you're not. Finally, explicitly note what content is yours within the debate. As I said, in terms of whipping, often who and specifically what team is making a contribution in debate is something that gets washed out or is not picked up by adjudicators. So just starting, a whipping point of information or any point of information by saying, we were the first team that told you X, why is it true? And continue a point of information from there. Say, when we told you in Prime Minister that this was the case, that just kind of sends a signal to the adjudicator that, you're in charge of that content. You were the team that made it. Sweet.